All right, and these next two pages, we're going to be looking at cell structures that are involved in the transfer of energy. And we're going to be looking at the mitochondria and the chloroplast. Now, I know that you've heard before that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And let's make sure that you really understand why that's the case. Well, instead of a powerhouse, what we're really talking about is we're talking about what a power plant does. So if this is the power plant, we know that the power plant provides electricity, and that's a usable form of energy. We can use it to charge our cell phones and to turn on our lights. And so the power plant gives us electricity. And again, electricity is energy that is usable. It's in a usable form. Now, where does that electricity come from? Because we have to get energy from a source in order to have it. And most of our electricity here in the Midwest is produced from coal. So coal has energy in it. If we burn coal, you'll be able to feel the heat, the energy in it in the form of heat. So coal has energy in it, but the energy is in the wrong form. You can't plug your cell phone into a piece of coal and expect your cell phone to get that energy and charge. So what a power plant does is it takes unusable forms of energy, so such as coal, it's got energy in it, it's just unusable, and it's able to release that energy and convert it into a usable form of energy. And so that's really what the mitochondria does. It takes unusable energy and converts it into a usable form of energy, okay? Now, this process that the mitochondria does is called cellular respiration. And when we say it takes energy, or it gets energy and converts it into a usable form, what we mean by that is the mitochondria is going to take glucose, and glucose is unusable chemical energy, and it's going to break it down, and then it's going to make ATP, which is a usable form of chemical energy. So when your reactions need an input of energy, your cells will use ATP. So all cells power their reactions by using ATP. ATP is a usable form of chemical energy. Now, the reason why we call it cellular respiration is because it relates to your respiration system. We breathe in oxygen and we get rid of CO2, and that's because we need oxygen for our mitochondria, and then they're going to produce CO2 and we need to be able to get rid of it. Now, the equation for this process, cellular respiration, we would say that we need to take in oxygen and we need glucose. We eat the glucose. Plant cells just make their own, but we have to consume ours. And we said that this process is we're trying to make ATP. So let's show one of the products is ATP. And when we break down glucose, we're going to also make a few other molecules that are byproducts of this reaction. We're going to end up making CO2, and I'm kind of running out of room here, and water, H2O. Okay. Now, hopefully you understand where the C, the O, and the H's are going to come from in order to make the CO2 and H2O, because the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. So if we take this molecule and break it up and rearrange the atoms, so now we have carbon atoms with oxygen, and we can have hydrogen atoms with oxygen. So here's where all those atoms end up being. And if we balance this equation, it's actually 6, and then we've got 6, and then we have 6, okay? And if you go back, you'll see there's 12, so 6 times 2, that's 12 hydrogen atoms. Well, one glucose molecule had 12, and we have then produced molecules that have 12 hydrogen atoms. And there is 6 carbon atoms that we find in the 6 CO2 molecules that are released, and there was 6 carbon atoms in glucose. So we're conserving matter. Whatever goes in must come out, okay? All right, so if I was going to draw kind of this process and how it relates to the mitochondria, and one reason or one way that you can tell this is a mitochondria is, see all these folds in here? Now, if you trace some of these folds, they look like it looks like you're making an M. So it might help you remember that the mitochondria looks like it has some M's inside of it, and that's just an inner membrane where the ATP is actually made. So to diagram what's happening here, we would say that the mitochondria is going to take in oxygen and glucose. So in those go, and then out comes what's made. So we have ATP molecules, we have CO2 molecules, and we'll get water molecules. Now, to help you remember that CO2 and water is made, you might think of whenever you were little and you would breathe on a window when it was cold outside and it would fog up. So when you're breathing out on that window, you're releasing CO2 and you're also releasing water molecules. And so then you're able to write on the window because there's now water on it. Okay, so in goes oxygen, glucose, out goes ATP, CO2, and water. Now, I also am going to take this and I want to make sure you understand that this is a cell. I'm going to write this. This is the cell membrane right here. Mitochondria is not a cell. It's an organelle inside the cell. So the cell will take in oxygen, glucose, send it to the mitochondria, and the mitochondria is going to make ATP, CO2, and water. Now, let's put a kind of a box around the ATP because cells keep the ATP that they make. Some students try to tell me like this cell is going to send the ATP out. No, it's going to actually send out the CO2, and then the CO2 you're going to end up breathing out. But any ATP the cell needs, it has to make it. No cells make ATP and send it to other cells. They have to make their own, okay? So they're going to use this ATP that they make. All right, now some basic concepts related to respiration. You're going to see that I'm going to say a lot that in respiration, glucose is broken down. This is a glucose molecule. If you count the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, we would have C6H12O6, okay? So in a really simplified model of what's happening is if you take this molecule, and this molecule has bonds between these atoms, if you break bonds in a molecule, then that energy that was stored in those bonds gets released. And that's what we're trying to show you. So during respiration, we say glucose is broken down, and then that energy, what is released, is transferred to an ATP molecule. Now, to make ATP, the whole thing doesn't have to be made. All the mitochondria does is it takes this part. If you remember, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So this molecule right here only has 2 phosphates on it. So this molecule is ADP. And remember that D stands for di, and di means 2. So when the mitochondria makes ATP, all it does is it's got an enzyme that can hook on to ADP, and it then can put another phosphate on it. So when bonds are formed, so let's show a bond is forming when that phosphate's put on here. So when bonds form, this energy that was released from glucose is now stored in those bonds that formed, okay? Let me move this a little bit so that there's not so much of a glare. I'm just showing that energy is now stored in that bond that's formed. And now we have this ATP molecule. So right now this ATP molecule has stored energy in it. Stored energy is in that bond. And remember, to use ATP for energy, all we have to do is break the bond, energy gets released, and we can use that energy to perform work for the cell, okay? Or supply energy for reactions. Now, really, this is pretty much all that happens to ATP. So when bonds are broken, energy is released. So let's use some ATP for energy here. So here we have a molecule, a transport protein in the membrane, and we need this molecule to change shape so that these molecules can go across the membrane through that transport protein? Well, you need energy. You need energy to do this job. So ATP can hook onto that transport protein. Notice that we break, so let's indicate that third bond. So we break that bond there, and we leave one of the phosphates behind, and that provides energy for this protein to change its shape, and now the molecules that were on the inside can go out, and the molecules on the other side can then load up, okay? So now we broke the bond. There's a phosphate group right here. Here's some ADP because we took a phosphate off of it, and so that's how we really use ATP to do different reactions or assist with reactions in the cell. All right, so we just went through cellular respiration. Cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. Now we're going to take a look at what happens in the chloroplast. Now, the chloroplast is going to look a little bit different than the mitochondria. They're about the same size, but remember the mitochondria kind of has folds in its membrane. The chloroplast is going to look like it has stacks of coins in it. So I'm going to kind of emphasize that. So if you look like it's got like stacks of money inside, stacks of coins, then you're looking at a chloroplast. Now, a chloroplast is going to be found in any organisms that do photosynthesis. So plants are going to have chloroplasts that do photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is a process like cellular respiration. If you know the equation for one, you should know the equation for the other. We're just going to write it backwards and change one word. So remember, we said that our equation for respiration, it took oxygen and glucose. Well, we are now going to make those be the product. Actually, let's just do this. I'm going to write this whole equation backwards on the other side for photosynthesis, and you're going to see that if you know this equation, if you just write it backwards and change one word, we're going to change this ATP for another word, then you've got your equation for photosynthesis. So I'm going to write water, CO2, and I'm going to put a different form of energy in there. So in photosynthesis, photosynthetic organisms are going to need water. You have to give a plant water. They need gas, they need carbon atoms so they can build their glucose. And I'm not going to put ATP, I'm going to put a different type of energy. I'm going to put light energy instead of ATP, which is chemical energy. And then I started off on respiration with oxygen and glucose, right? So we had water, CO2, I put light energy, glucose, oxygen. See, I'm just writing it backwards. So what this means is plants can take water, CO2, and light energy, and they can make glucose, and they also release oxygen in the process. And that glucose is C6H12O6. So if we want to build glucose, the plant needs to get carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, and oxygen atoms. And those are all right here in the water and the CO2. So to balance this, it actually takes 6 water molecules and 6 CO2s. And that's then going to give us the 6 carbon atoms. It's going to give us 12 hydrogens. And we have, we're going to have 6 oxygens plus those 6 oxygens right there. And that gives us our 12. So there's 6 oxygens here. And there is going to be 12 here. So we've got 12, and then we have 6 right here. So we've got all of our oxygens. All right, now, sometimes when we write the equation or we are describing what's happening in photosynthesis, we might rephrase what's happening here and say it different ways. But you still have to be able to recognize that if I'm talking about CO2 is being used or light energy is needed in order to produce glucose, you have to know I'm talking about photosynthesis. So there's many ways to kind of say this, to turn it into words or turn it into statements. Now, a couple things you have to remember is that glucose is an organic molecule because it has carbon and hydrogen atoms in it. So it is still photosynthesis. If I say plants are going to take CO2, they're going to take water. If I put light energy over the arrow, that's okay. And if I say that they're taking those to make organic molecules, that's still photosynthesis. And I am still being correct because glucose is an organic molecule. And we say that in photosynthesis glucose is made, but plants actually make all of their organic molecules. They make their sugars, they make their amino acids, they make their nucleic acids through photosynthesis. They make all their organic molecules, whereas we have to eat them. Now, remember that the formula for glucose is C6H12O6. So if we put in this blank, we write out the word glucose or we write C6H12O6, you still have to know that this is photosynthesis. And this technically means glucose, because that's primarily what is made in photosynthesis is glucose. That's what, out of all the organic molecules they do make in photosynthesis, the most they make is glucose. Now remember, glucose is a form of chemical energy. It's just in the wrong form. It's unusable for our cells. Our cells can't run off of glucose. Our cells run off of ATP. Just like your car can't run off of glucose. Your car runs off of gasoline or electricity. So another way that I can kind of abbreviate what's happening in photosynthesis is I can say that light energy is being converted into chemical energy. Because glucose is a form of chemical energy. So plants in their chloroplasts are able to take light energy and then take that energy, and when they build that glucose and those bonds form between the C, the H, and O, then we're storing glucose or storing energy. And anytime we have a molecule that's storing energy, we say it's a form of chemical energy. And then also remember, glucose is a sugar. So I can show this equation and I can write sugars in here, and you should be able to recognize it's still photosynthesis. All right, now let's take a look at what is happening in a plant cell. So let's put these two organelles inside a plant cell, and I hope that helps you remember plant cells, they do both. They have to do photosynthesis and they also have to do respiration, because cells don't run off of sugar. They run off of ATP, even plant cells. All the reactions are powered by ATP in all cells. So here we have a diagram that's just showing you what I've taught you about photosynthesis. So remember, for photosynthesis to occur, it needs to go light, CO2, and water. And here's the chloroplast. In goes light, in goes CO2, in goes water. And then out comes sugars and oxygen, specifically glucose. So here's our chloroplast doing photosynthesis. Out comes the glucose and oxygen. Now, this isn't, if we just stop, plants just stop right here, then they're going to die, because no cell reactions are powered by glucose. Glucose is chemical energy, but it's unusable chemical energy. Here's where we need the powerhouse of the cell. Is we need something that can take energy in an unusable form and actually turn it into usable chemical energy, a form of energy that cells can actually use. They can't use electricity. They have to use ATP for their reactions. So the mitochondria is going to do cell respiration. It can take in the oxygen and the glucose, and then it's going to make ATP. And again, this is really why cells have to do respiration, is they need ATP, but they also make CO2 and water as a byproduct. But again, these are the things that the chloroplasts need. So one thing to point out, we say that the mitochondria and chloroplasts are interdependent. What one makes, the other takes, okay? So again, if I have right here, I say this is the equation for photosynthesis. If you know it, you should automatically know the equation for respiration. If we just write this one backwards and change, instead of light energy, we're going to put a form of energy, chemical energy in there, ATP. So let's just write this backwards to help us remember that if you write photosynthesis backwards, you got respiration. So respiration, in goes glucose, in goes oxygen. And we're not going to put that light is made. We're going to change that form of energy to ATP. And then also produce CO2 and water as the products.